Thank you so much again, Dr. Pats, for those really important comments. So hello again, everyone. Before we delve into today's discussions with our esteemed panelists and moderators, I'd like to take a moment to ground us in the phased approach Dr. Bachara and Dr. Zhao mentioned that we're undertaking in partnership with Kaiser Permanente. So together, we're collaboratively building a research agenda aimed at addressing critical evidence gaps and understanding the most effective intervention methodologies for those most affected by climate change. We are really thrilled to see so many of you joining us today because we truly need your input in shaping a research agenda that aligns closely with the work that you're doing in the climate space. So throughout this convening, our goal is to provide a platform that facilitates insights from a diverse array of innovative climate experts, including bench scientists, clinicians, communication specialists, and community-based climate experts. We hope that by participating in today's discussions, you'll leave with additional research context to help bridge persistent gaps and advance your work. So as our opening speakers have highlighted, the impact of climate change is multifaceted and affects us all in complex ways. And so regardless of where you find yourself in the climate space, your input during today's event is invaluable as we strive to better understand your research needs and catalyze solutions in your respective areas of work. So we've created several avenues for you to participate in today's convening and contribute to building this research agenda together. The Slido platform allows you to ask questions throughout our sessions, enabling you to propose ideas and engage with our panelists and moderators. I want to emphasize the importance of your participation today in shaping this resource to ensure that it's valuable for your work. Your contributions matter, and we're eager to incorporate your insights into our ongoing efforts. So we will be routinely placing the link to an important survey in the Slido chat forum that will allow us to capture your specific desires to include in a research agenda that will help fill those critical research gaps in your spaces and places of work. So please take the time to fill out the survey throughout the day, and/or we welcome you to visit our Grand Challenge for Climate Change, Health, and Equity website, which also contains the survey to ensure that we can capture all of your great feedback. So I'll just take a couple of more minutes to share some specifics around our 5-phase process. If we could go ahead and share the slide that features the phases, that would be great. Thank you so much. So phase 1 of this process was our discovery phase. We interviewed 20 diverse climate experts, some of whom you will hear from today. We wanted to qualitatively gather their purview on research gaps at the intersection of climate change, health, and equity. The conversations we conducted in phase 1 were synthesized and research questions were formulated to help inform a preliminary literature search with our research librarians here at the National Academy of Medicine during phase 2. This search helped to validate many of the research gaps that were raised in our phase 1 interviews. So phase 3 of the process is where we are currently. We have gathered to optimize the opportunity to hear from you and other climate experts as we come together to create continued discourse around areas that should be included in a research agenda focused on research gaps. So the discourse surrounding today's convening will help usher us into phase 4 of the process, which is the collaborative building of a draft research agenda focused around research gaps. Phase 5 of the process includes creating a web portal with resources, tools, peer-reviewed articles, and literature related to interventions that are currently working to advance solutions for those populations most impacted by climate change. I also want to note that this web portal is meant to be accessible for all. So not just climate scientists or other climate academicians, we want diverse audiences to be able to visit the portal and obtain the information that will help advance climate solutions. This is why your participation in today's convening is pivotal to ensuring that this resource is helpful as you continue your work. So the same survey that we are sharing for contribution on the research agenda also has a space for you to contribute resources that you would like to see shared within the web portal. So I mentioned that phases 1 and 2 included analyzing the qualitative data from our interviews with experts as well as a literature search. Now, although this data doesn't detail all of the research gaps, we're still in the process as they relate to the intersection of climate change, health, and equity, we thought it might be helpful to share what we are starting to discover thus far. If we could feature the first research gap slide, that would be great. So you'll see that we found gaps as they relate to epigenetics and its role in understanding climate change and genetic expression, climate migration. We've also found gaps in implementation research. There are also gaps in the research as it relates to measuring individual exposure and response, building capacity with multidisciplinary partners. There are gaps in the impact of climate change on mental health, exposome research, and also utilizing AI for data synthesis. Next slide, please. So in our preliminary analysis, we've also found that there are gaps in biomarker identification, implementation science, and basic science research. We need more research on frameworks for involving community in climate change initiatives and frameworks for physician advocacy. You will hear the urgency behind all of these gaps and more during our convening today. So before I introduce our first panel, I would like to again thank you all for joining today and to remind you that we have additional activities happening this week at the National Academy of Medicine through our Grand Challenge on Climate Change, Health, and Equity. So on behalf of myself and my colleagues, we invite you to join us again April 25th for the Climate and Health Day of the U.S. Climate Action Summit. There you will hear from global leaders addressing actionable change in the climate space, and we will also be launching our new Accelerating the National Climate and Health Movement. This event is co-hosted with Kaiser Permanente. So we are excited to have you join us on April 25th for the day's events. So now we are ready to begin our discussions for today. I am honored to introduce our first set of panels, which will fall under our first theme, which is the overview of climate and health research gaps. Our first panel will address the biological and health impacts of climate change, and our second panel will address the intersection of the socio-environmental factors in climate change. The panels will be followed by a Q&A session that will be moderated by Dr. Darryl Zeldin. Many thanks to Dr. Zeldin for his contributions and insights earlier in our process to build the research agenda. Dr. Zeldin is a senior investigator and the scientific director at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. He is an internationally recognized expert in environmental causes of asthma. So Dr. Zeldin, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panels for today. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Shanae, and happy Earth Day to everybody. So I'm going to give a short overview that'll set up the presentations from the different panel members. If I could have the next slide. So back in 2022, NIH issued its strategic framework for the Climate Change and Health Initiative. And in 2023, we received about $40 million from Congress for CCH research specifically funded by NIH. The cog diagram on the left side of this slide illustrates the components of that program. So there are 4 core elements, and they're shown at the center of this diagram. Health equity refers to studies that include a perspective or focus on the concerns of rights for or impacts of under-resourced, underserved, and historically disadvantaged communities. Health effects research includes studies that include an investigation of the impact of climate change on human health outcomes. Intervention science includes studies that implement a planned strategy or method to reduce climate-related environmental exposures and or reduce the health impacts of these exposures, and studies that evaluate the adaptations or outcomes of these interventions. And training and capacity building includes studies that include activities designed to improve the ability of organizations, communities, or individuals to plan or conduct research related to climate change. On the outside portion of this cog diagram shows the 9 different specific areas of research, including basic mechanistic research, behavioral science and social science research, data integration, disaster research response, dissemination or implementation science, epidemiology or predictive modeling, exposure risk assessment, system science, and adaptation research. So together, this cog diagram outlines a broad scope of science in the climate change and health arena. How climate-related variables influence health, for example, the effects of ambient or extreme heat on mechanisms of disease or disease outcomes. Research on the extreme weather events and or climate disasters, such as hurricanes or floods or drought or wildfires, and their relation to health. How a changing climate impacts health, for example, observational and modeling studies to investigate changes in disease patterns or risk of dangerous exposures, including differential impacts on vulnerable populations, health implications of actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and or adapt to a changing climate, and methods and approaches to move the science forward, including data integration, transdisciplinary science, system science, and dissemination and implementation research. Next slide, please. So we did a portfolio analysis of all of the grants that NIH has funded in fiscal year 23 on the climate change and health arena. And we tagged those 65 grants across the cog diagram. And so you can see, and this gives you kind of a snapshot of what NIH is currently funding. So 36 grants were funded in the area of health equity, 19 grants in the area of training and capacity building, only 7 grants funded in the area of intervention science, and 58 grants in the area of health effects research. And on the outside, you can see the number of grants that are funded under each of the individual cogs. So 21 grants funded in basic and mechanistic research, 25 in behavioral social science research, 25 in data integration, 21 in disaster research response, only 3 in dissemination and implementation science, 30 in epidemiology, and only 4 in predictive modeling, 23 in exposure and risk assessment, 17 in system science, and again, 25 in adaptation research. Next slide. So we also looked at the major exposures of interest in the grants that were funded, and they include primarily air pollution, extreme weather events, various other psychological stress, and metals and so forth. And you can see on the lower right the main health outcomes of interest in the grants that are funded. And primarily they are working on morbidity and mortality in the respiratory system, birth outcomes, neurological, cardiovascular, and so forth. And so this gives you a snapshot for what NIH is currently funding. Next slide. So as an intramural investigator, I'm responsible for the intramural research program in climate change and health. And we've developed a 3-pronged approach in the IRP to address this issue. So the first approach is something called ITCH, or the Intramural Targeted Climate Change and Health Initiative. And this is a competitive application process where intramural scientists across all of the institutes receive seed funding to conduct research on climate change and health. And to date, we've had 2 cohorts of investigators that have been funded to conduct these studies at 8 different institutes, and you see their pictures on the right. And you can see that the topics of study really vary widely, from things such as wildfires and effects on epigenetics, to effects of climate change on reproductive health, to effects of climate change on cardiovascular endpoints and aging. Next slide. The second prong of our approach is building infrastructure within the IRP. And an example of this is we're in the process of purchasing climate exposures with physiological monitoring capabilities that will support both acute and long-term exposure studies that can't be currently done anywhere within the IRP or, in fact, within the nation. And the third cog, the third approach is something called the Climate Change and Health Research Center. So this is going to be the hub of the intramural response to the Climate Change and Health Initiative. It's a new center that will be a trans-NIH or an NIH-wide center, a virtual center, where all of the members will be conducting climate change and health research. And I want to point out that we're in the process now of recruiting an established mid-career scientist who will be the leader of this new center. And if you have anybody who you know about who's potentially interested in this, please have them contact me directly, and I'll provide more details. I think that's my last slide. And so let me proceed to introduce the panel members one by one. So the first panel member is Dr. Anne-Marie Jukic. She's from NIEHS. And so welcome, Anne-Marie, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. Yes, I am a reproductive epidemiologist, so I address climate change from that perspective. My goal is to translate animal and in vitro studies into human population studies. And so in the next 5 minutes, I'll describe some of the literature that I found that informed our most recent climate change project and some additional research gaps. Next slide, please. So in animal studies, it has been reported that gametes are kept at lower temperature than core body temperature. And this has been well examined in males, and the implications of heat for spermatogenesis are well known. However, studies in female animals and even one human study also show that the temperature of the follicle on the ovary where the egg is kept is about 3/4 to 1.5 degrees below core temperature. This could be important context for reproductive health. If the follicle has a lower homeostatic temperature, it's possible that heat stress occurs in the tissue at a lower ambient temperature than what causes heat stress to the core. Heat stress has also been associated with lower serum estradiol levels and with lower estradiol in the follicular fluid. Estradiol is lower in the summer, and acute heat stress in winter reduced estradiol to summer levels. Heat stress has also been associated in animals, again, with delayed ovulation, the occurrence of ovarian cysts, follicular apoptosis or cell death, and decreased luteinizing hormone or LH pulses. The LH pulsatility is important for follicle development and selection of a dominant follicle. These studies indicate that there are endocrine effects of heat exposure. Next slide, please. In addition to the endocrine effects, in vitro studies have suggested potential effects of heat on the uterine endometrium. Previous studies have reported that heat stress induces protein kinase B phosphorylation, or AKTP, in various cell types. In the endometrium, AKTP is reduced during healthy decidualization. Decidualization is the process of the uterus preparing for pregnancy, and it's really important for embryo implantation, which would of course affect fertility. In fact, AKTP is increased in those with endometriosis, which again is a disorder of the uterine endometrium. So it is possible that heat stress stimulates AKTP, which may negatively impact decidualization, which could lead to lower fertility. I actually didn't find any human studies that investigated this possibility. Next slide, please. In fact, I found no studies that examined the effect of heat stress on endometrial function or uterine health in animals or humans. In addition, I did not find any studies of heat and menstrual cycle hormones in humans. There are a few studies of heat and fertility more broadly, including miscarriage and birth outcomes. These studies are often limited to male occupational exposures, fertility clinic populations, or birth studies that make assumptions about fertility based on the frequency of subsequent live births. And these are great first steps. They're very important studies, but I think clearly we need more research on heat and fertility. And these two first bullets we are looking at in a clinical trial for which I'm the PI, called the Investigation of Vitamin D and Menstrual Cycles Trial, or INVITED for short. In addition to these two topics, the literature has suggested variability in heat responses based on species type or age. I think this makes it all the more important that we do studies in humans and investigate the role of other factors like age and the effect of age on heat response, particularly across reproductive age. Also, human studies will need to carefully consider timing. I've presented data that heat can cause changes in reproductive hormones, but heat responses may also depend on the current hormone levels or menstrual cycle phase of the person. So studies of heat effects in humans will have to carefully ascertain the timing of the exposure relative to the menstrual cycle phase. Finally, climate change has broad effects, and I have focused here on heat exposure. But in mice, for example, wildfire smoke exposure was associated with DNA methylation changes in sperm. We saw some of these results in the introduction to this entire symposium. So we've also seen that in rhesus monkeys housed in California during the wildfires, that they had an increased risk of pregnancy loss. I don't know of any studies that have looked at wildfire exposure and menstrual cycle hormones or the ability to conceive a pregnancy in humans. Similarly, while we know a lot about vector-borne illnesses in pregnancy and some of their associations with climate change and their effects with birth outcomes, there are few to no studies on reproductive function or fertility. In general, pregnancy and offspring outcomes tend to be addressed before these other health endpoints, leaving research gaps that could be addressed in the future. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for listening to my summary, and this is my name and contact information if there are any questions after the symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So the next panel member will be Dr. Ismayil Ahmet from National Institute of Aging. Ishmael.
Okay. Slide, please. Okay. I'm a staff science. I'm working in NIA. Basically, what my day job is doing this cardiovascular research in old individuals, cardiovascular research with aging. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay. So I feel like there is a huge knowledge gap between climate change and health. I try not to get into scientific jargon here to put you into sleep, but just giving you some basic information here. I'm curious about this climate change and health. I'm looking at the public medicine and what's the publication level right now. And I look at left side, I put the climate change and the health clinical research, and last 25 years, we only have 120 hits in the PubMed. And while I put the cancer and the health and clinical research, there's 171,000 hits in the public medicine. And also you can see this, if I put climate change and this preclinical, basically live animal research, last 15 years, we only have 25 publications about this. But meantime, we have, if I put cancer and the preclinical research, we have 106,000 publications. You can see, so there's so much difference between interest in publication, between cancer and the climate change. What's the outcome when you I look at this US Patent Office? When I put the climate change and the health, we only have 0 patent about this. So, and while at the same time, if you put cancer, there's a active patent, 700,000 patent in currently active, and then every year there's 40,000 new patents coming in. So you can see how much interest are different between interest in climate change and the health. Even we have so much huge problem coming from the climate change. There is an indication of lack of understandings, and because of lack of understandings, there is a lack of interest, and if there is a lack of interest, there is a lack of funding, and if there is a lack of funding, there is a lack of incentives. That's feeding the cycle. So there is a very few, not much huge interest in climate change and health research. And next slide, please. Okay, this how to fill the gap. When you're looking at the climate change and the news, the last 2022, we only have 1,600 people died by direct climate change related accidents. But meantime, we have 600,000 deaths registered in the United States by cancer. But when you're looking at these numbers alone, you miss huge part, because climate change, we only have directly died by climate change or heat wave or heat shock. And 1,600 is a very small number compared to 600,000. But the last year we have Texas heat dome happened last June, and we only recorded 334 fatalities. But when you're looking at this map, you have 330 million people exposed. And we only 300 people died by 6 days of heat wave, but we don't know what will happen. What happened to the 30 plus million people exposed to heat wave? What happened a week later? What happened to them a month later? What happened to the year later? Nobody knows this stuff. And especially we have a 50% of population is elderly and the people with pre-existing conditions like heart disease, stroke, and diabetic, everything else. And nobody knows this part. especially when you compare it to diabetes. Like nobody dies by a lower blood pressure, a lower glucose, but most people die by heart disease, complication of diabetic, like heart disease, the stroke, everything else. And we count all the related deaths as deaths by diabetic, but nobody say, okay, is there complication of climate change? We only look at the 334 fatalities, but we ignore what happened to these people during the time. And so we don't know what will happen, how it affects this climate change of human health, how this climate change, how to prevent these harms from climate change, how to protect our most vulnerable segment of population, especially with elderly and pre-existing conditions. So last year, we, thanks to the Dr. Zeldin, we got this each grant. Before I didn't even pay attention to climate change, and suddenly we have this specific grants. We start to running some experiments to recreate the heat waves in the lab, to see how exactly what happened to this body. And we exactly recreated this heat wave in the this middle picture. You can see this we have this environment controlled boxes. We can control the humidity and the temperature throughout the day. We program everything exactly, creating the Texas heat dome effect last year. This lasted for 6 days. We put young and old mice there to see how they respond on 6 days of heat wave. So what we find is even just merely 6 days of heat wave, exposing to heat wave, we have a huge deterioration of cardiovascular function in young and old mice, especially in old ones. And especially, they don't even lose body weight, but the vital organs like heart, liver, kidney shrink by 20%. Currently, we're looking at this effect. How this happened? What does it mean? And is that reversible? Is anything different in young and old? How are we going to protect this kind of damages? Next slide, please. So, call to action. And as a scientist, Dr. Zeldin already on it, doing a lot of stuff, but I still emphasize this, increasing the awareness, like in public, especially in the scientific field. Like until now, until I get this grant, I never pay attention to this climate change. Like us, most of us don't even pay attention to this. Even we know it's happening in the real life, and especially it's have to be increasing the investment. Like we have this cancer moonshots, you have Alzheimer's moonshots. Why not we have a climate change moonshot sometimes? Or increasing grants like intramural targeted climate health grants that we put me here. And also, from my own experience, we need to do this opening a specialized scientific field like climate change, especially doing current climate change. We have thermoregulation research, but it's completely different from the climate change research. It's completely different. The goal is different. So from my own experience, we all specialize in very specific way. Like me, I'm only doing cardiovascular and this aging. When I do this research, well, I feel like we have a multifaceted challenge, a multifaceted collaboration needed for this kind of research. Because climate change can affecting all body systems, not only cardiovascular, it's affecting the nervous system, it's affecting the immune system, it's the reproduction system. So we need all these people with specialized background to come together to solve this problem and to figure out how to protect our most vulnerable population. Thank you. Thank you for listening to me. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Ismayil. So the next panel member is Dr. Michael Skinner from Washington State University. Michael.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak about a really important project. This is, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some basic research that will directly link climate change to biology in terms of how it works. And on this first slide, you can see that we've known for over 120 years that the genome was really critical for everything. The DNA sequence had all the genes in it, and those genes actually ran what was going on. And then this causes the gene expression, physiology, and biology. In the past 20 years, 20, 30 years, what we've realized is the DNA sequence in and of itself cannot regulate itself. It can't really regulate what genes are on and off. And so really there had to be some other function or activity going on. And this is called epigenetics. So in the past 20, 30 years, we've realized that there's lots of these epigenetic factors, which I'll describe in a minute, that essentially regulate how the DNA works, such that this affects the expression, physiology, and biology, and so forth. Now, the reason I'm speaking here is it turns out that the way the environment, any environmental factor, regulates biology is mediated through the epigenetics to cause the genome effect, expression, and sort of biology event. So this is now a molecular factor, which we didn't have before, that explains what's going on. And the next, there you go. Essentially, the definition of this epigenetics is really molecular factors and processes around the DNA that regulate the genome activity completely independent of DNA sequence. Sequence has nothing to do with it, otherwise it would be genetics. And these are also mitotically stable. So when a cell divides into two cells, not only is the DNA replicated, the epigenetics is also replicated. And essentially, this is what drives, let's say, a specific cell type to maintain its function as it divides into new hepatocytes or neurons or whatever. And so essentially, this is the definition of this epigenetics. In the next slide, essentially, here's a couple of the epigenetic factors that are known today. The first one that was identified back in originally it was proposed in the 50s, but it was actually identified sort of in the 80s. This is the DNA methylation. This is where a small methyl group gets stuck to a cytosine residue, and whether something's heavily methylated, it can turn a gene off. If it's not heavily methylated, the gene can stay on. So the methylation can actually regulate what genes are on and off. They can also influence the interactions of some of these others. The next one that was identified, mostly in the 80s and 90s, was histone modifications. There's chemical modifications of these histone molecules that the DNA gets wrapped around in terms of nucleosomes. These can also turn genes on and off. Then there's chromatin structure, whether they're supercoiling, how tight the things are wrapped, that will also turn genes on and off. Then there's these non-coding RNAs, these very short non-coding RNAs that actually associate with proteins. They will bring them to the DNA and allow a regulatory process. So here as we see a non-coding RNA, they can actually bind to methyltransferase that pulls it in, and basically it's binding, causing where the methylation is going to be. And so there's this interaction going on. And then there's these non-coding RNAs that the new one is called RNA methylation that can also have a role. So all of these molecular factors that are starting to be analyzed very extensively, that's what actually regulates how the genome functions. Okay, so in the next slide, essentially over the past 20 years, what we've found is that there's a whole series of environmental chemicals, environmental factors that actually can regulate what epigenetics goes on and off. And so this shows environmental toxicants here, just a few of them. Things like high-fat diet, caloric restriction can do the same thing. The temperature and drought can do the same thing in plants and flowering. Smoking and alcohol can do it. Stress and trauma can actually promote this behavioral effects and promote these things as well. And what is the newer sort of thing that I don't have time to get into in detail, but essentially if an individual is exposed, and that epigenetics actually can change the epigenetics of the sperm or the egg at the germline. It turns out that gets programmed and can go to the next generation. And it can pass to all subsequent generations to come. For flies and worms, this has been shown to go out hundreds of generations, the same thing plants. Whereas in mammals, we've taken it out to maybe 10 generations or so, and it's maintained. So this epigenetics that's induced by the individual exposed then gets carried to the subsequent offspring, future generations. In the next slide, essentially, these climate impacts on biology. The first one we've heard about in a couple of the talks was temperature. And so it turns out heat and cold can actually regulate epigenetics, can actually be induced, and it can become transgenerational. Light, in terms of whether there's increased UV radiation, that kind of thing, that can also do it depending on the organism. terms of plants and crop growth, this is directly related to these types of environments. Caloric restriction, high-fat diets, how much food an individual gets will do it. Pollution, intoxicants will actually do this. Air quality, in terms of particulates and so forth, will actually have these epigenetic effects and influence on epigenetic and transgenerational. Water quality, salinity, contamination, population densities, which create this stress and trauma, will do the same thing. Now, what the thing we have not thought about at all in the past is the fact that it's not just the individual exposed. On the right, we see this climate impact on this individual, can be male or female, such that it's influencing their germline. This germline effect then goes to subsequent generations. And it turns out in all the studies that have been done, the initial environmental impact is usually has fairly negligible effects on the individual exposed. But the great-grand offspring can have significant disease offset because of this generational sort of impact. And so we need to start thinking about it's not just who's getting exposed today, it's actually what the future generations are actually inheriting from us in terms of this climate change. Okay, so in the next slide, essentially what we have here is that climate change can actually directly influence all of these epigenetic mechanisms I mentioned. When that happens, it basically can cause this genome activity and what genes got turned on and off. And essentially, in the next slide, essentially what this does, so essentially this environment causes these epimutations, these epigenetic changes to be put in place in the genome, like the DNA methylation sites. They get programmed permanently. Those then alter the gene expression profile. They'll cause, and when there's abnormalities, depending on the cell type being looked at and so forth, it'll cause a phenotypic variation in the cell and cause then a potential disease susceptibility, influencing the biology and disease. Okay. And in the next slide, essentially, this affects all biology, just not our biology. Essentially, if you take complete populations of individuals or organisms, and you shift the phenotypic variation of that organism, essentially you're causing, because of the environment, a shift in basically adaptation events which influence natural selection and evolution. So these environmental effects through epigenetics is what actually has helped drive evolutionary biology in the past in terms of these adaptive sort of situations and natural selection. So this is not just isolated to disease and pathologies and so forth that can occur during climate change. It actually is impacting our complete populations and potentially future populations in the future. So this is something that climate change is not just effects on us today, and that once we get rid of it, it's going to go away. We're actually inducing in our populations today these epigenetic things that are being inherited for generations to come. So with that, I'll finish. And happy to answer any questions later.
Great, thank you, Michael. So we're going to transition to the second panel, which is going to focus on intersection of socio-environmental factors and climate change, and then we'll convene all of the panelists at the end for the combined Q&A session. So the first couple of speakers in the second panel will be Dr. Arianne Teherani and Dr. Sheri Weiser from the UCSF Center for Climate, Health, and Equity. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And Arianne and I are co-founding directors of the University of California Wide Center, and we highlight here gaps in research along several dimensions, including topical gaps, regional gaps, gaps in exposure and outcome. And can you go to the next slide? And methodologic gaps. And next slide. So first of all, there's a critical need for transdisciplinary research and bringing a climate justice lens that really centers the experience and needs of disproportionately impacted communities. So in terms of topical gaps, there's a need for more research on adaptation and mitigation solutions. So we need more research on the climate resilience of health systems, including their ability to recover from climate-related shocks, and also on the most effective strategies to improve healthcare decarbonization. There is still limited understanding of how climate change intersects with social and structural factors to worsen health and how to intervene on these modifiable factors to improve health. So regionally, as Dr. Zhao mentioned, there's an overrepresentation of high-income countries like the US, Europe, and China, and not enough on low-income countries and communities who experience the worst health consequences from climate change. In terms of exposures, we need, as others have mentioned, to consider more varied exposures, as well as the compounded impacts of multiple simultaneous exposures, such as experiencing a wildfire smoke event during a heat wave. It is also critical to take into account many indirect factors that intersect to mediate and moderate the impacts of climate change on health. So in terms of outcomes, studies tend to be focused on a narrow range of primarily physical health outcomes. So we need more investigations of mental health outcomes and outcomes across the lifespan. And this includes for diseases like HIV/AIDS, which have been under-researched in the climate health literature. We need more research on how to communicate climate and health data to researchers, to communities, learners, and policymakers in a way that really puts actionable evidence at their fingertips to facilitate action. So methodologically, we need to adapt novel methodologies in the field like advanced machine learning and causal inference approaches. And we also need to bring in more mixed methods and community-engaged approaches. We also need to draw upon knowledge synthesis methods to support translation of evidence into practice. And we think most critical is research that supports the development of evidence-based, equity-focused solutions, their implementation at scale, and also studying co-benefits and outcomes. And next slide, please. So at the UC Center for Climate Health and Equity, we're advancing a research agenda that seeks to fill many of these gaps. So we're covering topical gaps in our research, particularly looking at health system preparedness to heat and wildfire smoke events. We're also studying evidence-informed education offerings to communities, such as social vulnerability and protection during heat events, and also to health providers on how to best communicate climate and health links. Regionally, we're launching new research in places like Kenya, Rwanda, Philippines, and Vietnam, and we are also working in disproportionately impacted communities in California. We're also looking at multiple exposure pathways and co-occurring climate stressors, such as heat waves and wildfires concurrently. So in terms of health outcomes, we're broadening to new topics like HIV/AIDS. So we have a funded R01 study looking at climate impacts on HIV treatment and care outcomes across 44 countries. And we're also investigating the rise of eco-anxiety along the lifespan and how to build mental health resilience in the face of climate stressors. And I'll turn to Arianne to continue.
Thanks, Sheri, and thank you everybody for having us. So methodologically, we are engaged in using machine learning to create these multi-dimensional vulnerability profiles that cover both modifiable and non-modifiable social and structural factors. We're using qualitative research to assess the mechanistic pathways for how climate change impacts health. And we're working with communities, engaging them to develop these adaptation solutions-focused studies. We also just recently launched a global Translating Knowledge to Action initiative on knowledge synthesis of social factors that impact climate, health, and justice, and the translation of that knowledge into practice. To give a couple of specific examples of the kinds of things that we're working on in the Bay Area, we're working with policy and community partners on a research project to help bolster both community and health system resilience to wildfire smoke by understanding the barriers and the facilitators to implementation of Department of Public Health recommended strategies to reduce the health harms in disproportionately impacted communities. And in Kenya, we have been working with a transdisciplinary team, which includes a climate adaptive agriculture intervention aiming to improve food and water security and HIV health outcomes among individuals affected by climate-related drought and flooding. We found improvements along the physical health, mental health, and social indicators for multiple household members, including adults with HIV and children and adolescents. And with that, the next slide, please. We highlight 4 areas. We include, first, the importance of targeting modifiable social and structural factors like material need insecurities and the built environment in climate adaptation and mitigation interventions to improve health. And this work must also ensure that co-benefits, so for example, improved social equity, are incorporated. Second, we need to fundamentally change how we work. So climate change is a multifaceted, complex problem with interdependent causes that appear daunting to solve. What Hans Ritter named the wicked problem, right? So solving wicked problems can be accomplished through transdisciplinary research and global collaboration. Climate and health equity incubators or think tanks are needed that bring together researchers, communities, policymakers, and practitioners to develop viable solutions based on scientific evidence. And climate justice work and community involvement really needs to be interwoven in all stages of our work. Third area is that we know the problem, but we don't know how to fix the problem, right? So solutions-oriented intervention research is key to that. And interventions are needed at different levels, so the household, community, health systems, and regionally. And finally, we do need to build the evidence to policy pathways. So policies for solutions that address health are growing. Rigorous evaluation of these policies are key to inform broader implementation. And so this also means that predicting the health impacts of various climate scenarios to guide policymakers to prioritize interventions and resource allocation is critical. And finally, regularly synthesizing the evidence to inform policy through systematic reviews, meta-analyses, rapid reviews will help continuous update of policies based on the latest science. And so we want to close really by underscoring that with 5% of global climate funding dedicated to health, there is a critical need for more funding, which ensures that this area remains a priority and that evidence to policy pathways are sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Arianne, and thank you, Sheri. So the next panel member is Dr. Anne-Christine Duhaime from Massachusetts General Hospital.
Thanks very much. What I'm going to talk about is a little different from what other people have talked about, which is a different view of the problem from a sort of a neuroscience point of view. And it will have themes that you've heard from the other speakers, going back to Dr. Zhao about the cross-disciplinary problems and adaptation and mitigation. Dr. Ahmet talked about that a lot of people don't have knowledge or interest in climate change and health. Dr. Skinner talked about epigenetics, things that happen over generations for hundreds of years. Dr. Wortzel is going to talk about mental health, and our most recent speaker talked about this wicked problem. So we're going to take a high view of why this problem is so difficult for us and then some of the challenges. So the high view is that when we talk about interdisciplinary work, we typically talk about what's up in the left-hand side of your screen, that, you know, I know something and I know a little bit about your field, you know a little bit about mine. And when the three of us, you know, three disciplines come together, that part in the middle is the sweet spot. But climate change is not like what we're used to. It is so big that it encompasses everything. And that virtually as it worsens, as we can expect that climate change will worsen no matter what we do, it'll worsen more if we don't do things that we all know we need to do, but it will affect every aspect of health. So health is embedded in climate change. And the equity issues also are not an intersection. Most of the health problems will affect those least able to care for, least able to be resilient, bigger than everything. Let's have the next slide, please. But in the health, next slide, please. In the health world, most of us know the most about health. And people in the health sector, like myself as a physician, I happen to be a neurosurgeon, you know, I can tell you a lot about health issues. I can do research, which I have done for my whole career, in the issues that affect the patients I care for today, tomorrow, and into the next decade or two. But I don't know enough about climate change. And frankly, in my career, maybe not so much in people in other aspects of medicine, my knowledge of equity is pretty slim. But I can tell you a lot about my particular specialty, the biomedical science behind it, the approaches to the problems that we see. But this other stuff is just nothing I learned about. I had to teach myself. And the equity issues are things that people in public health, people in policy know a lot more about than I do. And yet, we all have to address this problem. So therein lies our challenge. And I think it reflects what I'm saying, reflects what other people have said. Next slide, please. And I look at this from, as one of our speakers said, we got to take the big view, the evolutionary view. It isn't surprising that this is a wicked problem for us, as Dr. Teherani said. And if you look at how the brain was designed, over what forces. This is just a sort of a thought experiment to help you. If you think of the entire duration of our planet as a 40-day walk across the United States, starting in San Francisco when the planet was formed, and now is the center of Times Square, our brain evolved to solve problems all along the way. And it started back in Salt Lake City when single-celled organisms were first evolved. And we got to multicellular organisms and about halfway through in Iowa City, and we got to mammals in Scranton, PA. But the way our brains are designed to work and solve problems, including climate and health, started way back in the middle of the country. And it is built on those underpinnings of short-term problem solving for immediate survival-based problems. That's how we work as decision makers. That's how we evolved. Those were the pressures we evolved under. And then if you look at the right part of the slide, the Anthropocene, the era of climate change, doesn't happen until the last step of your 40-day walk hits the present time in the center of Times Square and your big toe hits the ground. That is the Anthropocene. So the point of this slide is to just say, we are working with equipment, neural equipment, problem-solving equipment that was designed for a different era and different pressures. And this problem is wicked because this is really, really hard for us because of the way the challenges intersect with things we don't know much about. Next slide, please. So again, big picture overview. I'd like to talk about 3 curves. And this is just to set the stage for what I think some of the problems are that we have to address and some of the research gaps that we have. Now, these 3 curves that you see on the left side of your screen are not to scale along the timeline axis, the x-axis, but they are 3 things that are happening at the same time. So let's start with the middle graph, which is a graph from Dean Spears at University of Texas at Austin that was published in the New York Times recently about the projections of world population. And to the left side where things are low, this is, millions of years ago. And that rapid change has happened over the past, several hundred years to our current population. Again, hard to see on this slide, but where the black line ends and the little circle is, that's now. That's actually 2020, about 8 billion people. We are projected to go up to about 10 or 10.5 billion by about 2080. And then the projections are that world population is going to decline quite rapidly. The one can argue about that, and we can talk during question and answer. Above that, the curve is the temperature curve. Now, this is stretched out, and to get it to line up with that population curve, it would have to be squished, and the lines would be a little bit different shape. But the point is that these are the projected temperatures, depending on what we do with our carbon emissions and our greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that it is, going up almost no matter what we do, but how quickly it comes down depends on what we do. And those temperatures are going to increase at the same time that our population is peaking. The bottom curve I'm going to spend less time on, but that is the pace of change. This happens to be a diagram of Moore's law, which is the logarithmic change in the technology of semiconductors. And I think that neurologically, this is a problem for us because I think we are outpacing our ability to process the rate of change. And I think this is a challenge for people accepting climate change. It's like the very planet is changing. This is really difficult for people. And I think this interweaves with mental health and many other issues, denial and other psychological responses to climate change. So what is our challenge? Now we're going to the right-hand side of the slide, and out there is the brain. That's the brain's reward system, which is how we make decisions. And our challenge is to get over the hump of both population peak and climate change peak. Pace of change we can talk about otherwise, because as our other speakers have pointed out, this problem is going to affect every aspect of health, and especially and most harshly in the places that have the least ability to be resilient. Our vision of the future is going to be, new technologies, new ways of living, new ways of having buildings, new energies, and we need to have a vision for the future. Next slide, please. So what are our research agendas? I think that the big questions are who? Is this most of us in the health sector or just some of us? People in public health, people in primary care, people who study lung diseases, is that who should study this? Or is it all of us? And I would ask, what do we have to offer in medicine? A science background, knowledge of the big picture. It's tricky. Another question that I think is a research need and gap is how big? Of our various actions, which ones have the biggest impact? There's a well-known children's book, The Sizeosaurus, which talks about size, and we don't have a good way of comparing choice A to choice B in climate change impact, both by mitigation and adaptation. And we need to not compare it to how many cars are on the road. We need to compare it to other actions we could take by the health sector. Finally, I think our biggest challenge is how to incentivize, and going back to what Dr. Ahmet said, I mean, is climate change and health a hobby for medicine, or is it part of our profession? You don't necessarily get academic credit for it. There are some specialists in it, but it's a very small part of the problem of those people who specialize. And you know, we have our short-term priorities, which is not surprising based on the way our brain design evolved. And it's sort of like, sorry, but I'm busy curing cancer. I can't think of this, and yet we must. So I think these are our challenges. How do we understand this problem from a very big perspective? How do we understand how we work as decision makers? And how do we understand the various impacts that the health sector can play in this wicked problem? On that, I'll end, and thank you. We'll go to the next speaker.
Thank you, Anne-Christine. So the last panel member who will speak is Dr. Joshua Wortzel from Brown University. Josh?
Thank you so much for having me here. I am the chair of the American Psychiatric Association's Committee on Climate Change and Mental Health. And when we think of the impacts of climate change and mental health, we think of it in three primary buckets. There are the direct impacts of heat on the brain and psychiatric outcomes. There are indirect biological effects with the many ripples of what climate change causes. And there are also the psychological effects. I'll go into each of those categories, but I hope that frames your understanding of what you walk away from today. So we can go to the next slide. When we think about the direct impacts of heat on the brain, there are some pretty robust data about the epidemiology of how heat waves show, here in the first graph, higher rates of violent crime. This has been shown with rape and suicide as well, and even increased hospitalization for a number of psychiatric conditions. This is an Egyptian hospital study looking at hospitalizations for mania, and you can see that this is highest during the spring and summer months. There's been long literature looking at how patients have difficulties with thermoregulating going back to the 1800s. Patients with depression and bipolar disorder have higher baseline temperatures compared to healthy controls. Patients with schizophrenia have actually lower baseline temperatures and dyssynchrony of their circadian temperatures. And this has also been borne out in how our psychiatric patients are more prone to heat wave related morbidity and mortality. There's 3 times heat wave related morbidity for patients with mental illness, and patients on psychotropics can also have increased risks. There are some case control studies that have shown that patients on antipsychotics have 6-fold odds of hospitalization, anticholinergics 4.6, and we know that SSRIs cause diaphoresis. There are a number of different impacts physiologically that these medicines have. We need to be mindful of that. When we think about the mechanisms of how this works, it's still in its infancy about how heat impacts mental health. Disrupted sleep is one, interrupted functional brain connectivity is another, and just understanding how physiology is coordinated by neurotransmitters both centrally and peripherally. I'm personally very interested in studying the impacts of heat on mental health, and to date, it's been mostly done through use of satellite data to measure how there are correlations between city level or county level temperatures and mental health outcomes. I think there's a lot we can do with wearable devices and more nuanced personal microclimates. If we can go to the next slide, please. When we think about indirect biological effects, as I said, there are many ripples of how putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere affects health. I'll mention 3, although there are others. We think about exposure to fine particulate matter, especially 2.5 microns, and ozone from burning fossil fuels and forest fires. There is robust literature looking at how this affects health throughout the lifespan. If you're in utero, you have a higher risk of neurodevelopmental disorders. In adolescence and adult years, higher rates of affective disorders. And in the geriatric population, lifetime exposure has been associated with dementias and neurodegenerative disorders. When we think about crops, there's a lot of emphasis on how aridity is going to affect our ability to feed the population. And we just saw that graph of population size. But even looking at the nutritional content of food, We see that crops grown experimentally in atmospheres expected by 2050 will sequester less zinc and iron and produce less protein, which for many parts of the world will have consequences for their neurodevelopment. When we think about where bugs that carry diseases live, that's also going to change as climates change, and many of those carry neuropsychiatric sequelae. In fact, the WHO has identified 11 zoonotic illnesses that are more likely to occur and spread with climate change, and many of them carry risks of encephalitis and encephalopathy. Just to show you one example, this is Lyme disease. The darker blue areas represent where it's been endemic in America, and the light blue shows as of just the past 20 years, essentially, how this area of where areas of Lyme disease are endemic has changed. Next slide, please. And then finally, there are psychological effects of climate change. And we can think of this in three buckets as well. There are acute traumatic exposures, things like hurricanes, typhoons, et cetera, that hit an area. And there's a relatively robust literature that's looked at the consequences of this, including rates of trauma, affective disorders, interpersonal violence, substance use, et cetera. An area that's a growing area of research is chronic traumatic exposures. So these are areas that are hit by repeated natural disasters or slow-moving natural disasters like drought or ocean level rise leading to flooding. And this can also result in conflict and displacement, compounding the acute traumatic effects. And then finally, we have vicarious exposures to climate distress. This has to do with what we see in the world around us and on the news about how the world is changing from climate change. And this leads to a lot of distress, a term bandied around called climate anxiety or climate distress, captures the range of emotions that people feel. It's quite common. We know that in America, close to 30% of adults are very to extremely worried about climate change, close to 60% of young people across the world. And in fact, actually 45% of young people say it affects their daily life and functioning. We know very little about what that actually looks like with symptomology psychiatrically. If you can go to the next slide, please. So when we tie all of this together of how we need to fill various voids in our understanding of how climate change impacts mental health, I think of it also in these buckets. When it comes to heat, we need to move toward understanding experience temperature versus just atmospheric temperature. I mentioned how currently we're looking mostly at satellite images using wearable devices, and it sounds like NIH is already looking at how to more minutely look at how climates change is a wonderful next step. Understanding mechanisms of how heat impacts the epidemiology we're seeing, who's vulnerable. There are so many intersecting social determinants of health, I'll mention those at the end, that may compound in the context of heat. Interventions both on the individual and community side, and then understanding how our pharmacology may be impacting people's ability to thermoregulate. The indirect effects, we need to understand the scope of the ripples. I mentioned three, although there are many others. Dr. Skinner, I'm very interested in the epidemiological piece or the epigenetic piece as well. Who's vulnerable? Modifiable factors, how can we protect against these issues, whether it's air particulates and having people have filtering devices or masks and so forth, and how do we educate our medical workforce so that they can help intervene where possible. When we think about natural disasters, especially we need to think about the chronic and recurrent traumas that they're going to be experiencing as climates change and interventions to support. I mentioned climate distress. We frankly still don't have many validated scales yet about how to even measure this, how it's impacting mental health symptoms, who's vulnerable, interventions, again, on the individual and community level, and how we can train parents and adults to support young people with this. Resilience is key. This has also been mentioned by multiple other colleagues here. How do we foster resilience on the public health level and through psychoeducation on the lay public level? And thinking again about climate change as a threat multiplier of social determinants of health, there are many people who are likely at higher risk of these areas that I've mentioned, including children, the BIPOC community, communities of color, the global South that's less resourced, impoverished communities within our own borders, gender-based differences, et cetera. So I'm so grateful that NIH is investing in trying to identify these gaps and how we can try to fill them. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. So We're going to enter now the Q&A open panel discussion portion of the session. We'll have about 20 or 30 minutes for this. And so I'm going to ask a few questions just to kind of lead things off, and then we'll also be taking questions from the live audience. And I think we'll probably just do this in a Hollywood Squares way, where I'll go around and just ask each of the panel members to comment. If you can keep your comments succinct, that would be great, so everybody has a chance to opine. So the first question I have, so each of you mentioned specific research gaps in your presentation. The question is, how will addressing these gaps contribute to mitigating climate change's impact on health, while also addressing the interactions between climate, health, and equity? So let me start with our first presenter, Anne-Marie Jukic. Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. So I think, I mean, probably it goes even in my research area, the same for many research areas, but understanding the mechanisms and how things work and how on a population level people are being affected is the step to trying to implement change. And I didn't mention in my talk, but talking about interventions, what interventions exist for combating climate change or heat exposure in terms of reproductive health, menstrual cycle health, or gynecologic health. Those are areas that are underexplored. So if we could address that research gap, then we have a chance at trying to help an individual take some autonomy and do something to protect their health in the face of a climate that is hard for an individual to control.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Ismayil, do you want to comment on that as well?
I basically the same idea as Mary Joki, and I think you have to increase some funds to have some interest in people like me to get into this field and to have impact on this policy, everything else, because we as science has to be based on the evidence-based research. If we don't know anything about how this climate change affecting, especially heat waves affecting everybody's health, and nobody believe us, and we need this kind of evidence. So in order to have this evidence prepared, then we need some funding to increase the funding to awareness, and then we have provided real data to try science data to educate the public, and everything else. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael, your comment?
I agree with all the discussion earlier. The molecular mechanism of epigenetics can't really be reversed necessarily. And so thinking that you could do something to cause the pathologies that develop to go away may be far more difficult than we think. We can do epigenetic biomarkers to determine the severity of things later in life. So maybe you could come up with preventative treatments for the pathologies. You won't be necessarily able to fix it. And so I think that's something that needs to be pulled in. And so the overall, in terms of priorities, I think we really need to better understand the molecular mechanisms involved. There are some current studies which have done resilience, and that resilience, arts and culture can actually cause epigenetic effects to do, and they do good things. And so essentially by understanding both the bad things and good things, we might be able to get a sort of medium sort of situation to reverse some of this stuff.
Arianne, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think in terms of sort of ways in which to operationalize these gaps that we talked about, our focus has really been driving action-oriented research and to be able to address the needs on the ground as quickly, effectively, and equitably as possible. So I think some of the questions that we have asked ourselves, the key considerations that we take into account are, for example, does the research question we're asking align with community and policy needs? Will findings be actionable within a rapid time frame for those folks? So for example, can I produce a rapid review on topic X that can be put in the hands of decision makers or policymakers to make a change? Will the benefits of this research accrue to those in society who need it the most? And, in keeping with a similar note to Dr. Duhaime, how can I as a researcher bring my expertise to develop, for example, a robust evaluation of interventions and solutions to inform others? So those are some of the ways in which we weigh and think about how we will address the gaps.
Thank you. Sheri, your comment?
Great. Yeah, so just building on others, I think the most important gap we mentioned is this solution-focused intervention research that's co-developed with community partners. So if we are able to test these adaptation and mitigation solutions, we're then going to understand the environmental and health co-benefits of each intervention, possible harms, and we'll be able to employ the best practices for implementation, so using an implementation science approach. And as people mentioned, we're certainly most likely to see successful outcomes when we partner with affected communities at all phases of research, so design, implementation, and dissemination. And another key point is that we're unlikely to find a one-size-fits-all approach, since the way that climate change affects health, as well as the best solutions for addressing it, really are likely to differ from setting to setting, and the solutions we deploy will require flexible thinking so that we can continue to adapt to changing climate conditions. And just a very brief example. So in Kenya, the water irrigation intervention that I mentioned, or that Arianne mentioned, worked great for the drought condition. But then when weather changed over time to also include excessive rains, well, then the participants' crops were flooded and eaten by hippos, and that undermined the health benefits. So then we therefore needed to devise new solutions, such as training our farmers to dig trenches to keep the hippos away as a way to improve health.
Thank you. Tina, what are your comments?
I think the biggest issue is funding for transdisciplinary implementation of what the findings are. So it's one thing to work in your silo and say, okay, I'm going to study, the health effects of heat on X, Y, or Z disease process, but that does nothing if we can't A, communicate it to the public, B, implement it with policy makers, and have it actually change things. And it's, I think right now, because of the nature of this problem, there are mechanisms to get funding in climate and health, but there aren't mechanisms to get funding in climate and health and policy and implementation all at once. And that's where the gap is, in my opinion. Thanks.
Thanks. And last, Josh, your comment? You're muted.
My apologies. Just to that last point, I think that we have to provide the data so that then we can go to the policymakers and say, look, this is what needs to be done. But I know, speaking as someone in psychiatry, we have knowledge of the kinds of psychological defenses that are getting in the way of society making the kinds of changes we need. And I think that we need training and we need science around how, as physicians, we can use our voices to do the kind of advocacy work that's going to push the dial. So it's not only the basic science and understanding the disease processes, but it's also how do we make society change and move through some of the kind of archaic neurology that Dr. Duhaime was mentioning.
Thank you. So Tina mentioned the importance of interdisciplinary research. And I guess my question is, what elements or facets that academia or other research sectors should do to facilitate or promote interdisciplinary research in this area? So maybe let's go to Arianne first, and then some of the other panel members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zeldin. I think there are some general principles that we often debate about the values of academia that also apply here as well. And so some of the recommendations that come to mind for me are thinking about the ways in which our universities, our research institutions should provide strong support for transdisciplinary work, including administrative backing, funding opportunities, recognition and hiring and promotion criteria. I've often thought about how institutions should integrate transdisciplinary approaches into their educational programs that can prepare the next generation of climate and health researchers. So, for example, this does include offering courses and degrees that cross traditional academic boundaries. And I think Dr. Zhao also mentioned this when he was talking about sort of bringing together, the agricultural sector, public health, communications, and providing training and collaboration and communication skills. And then I also do want to emphasize that institutions should develop new metrics for assessing the impact of transdisciplinary research that goes beyond the traditional sort of academic citations. So looking at policy changes, which a lot of us are really talking about here, community benefits and community engagement.
Thank you. Michael Skinner, do you want to comment on the importance of transdisciplinary research as well?
Absolutely. I agree with everybody that's speaking so far. So the issue is, my concern about it is that the government funding for this sort of thing is not really there. In other words, there's lots of grants to do the molecular stuff. There's lots of grants to do the pathology and so forth. And so to do a disciplinary sort of approach is difficult to get funding for. And so I think that that's definitely something we could put into this, because this is a much broader sort of topic, as Anne mentioned. And so essentially, I think really it's the funding agencies that could drive this by grid.
Darryl, if I can be rude and interrupt.
Absolutely.
Love to hear NIH point of view. And, I've said in my talk, funding agencies need to come together to fund these things in a more strategic way. NSF, NIH, foundations, you name it. So I think what you're hearing from everybody is, what's the largest biomedical research enterprise like NIH doing about this, right? You got $40 million to start off doing something, but it requires much, much more. And love to hear what you think will happen at NIH in this area.
So as you know, Dr. Zhao, we can't lobby Congress for additional funds, but we have friends that do the lobbying for us, including the National Academy. And we need to increase that number. Is the long and short of it. I mean, the president's budget has consistently been more than that, but we're dealing with priorities in the nation that are sometimes taking priority over. So I don't know that I have a crystal ball or a magic bullet that I can throw at this. I can tell you that the money that we're getting at NIH, the $40 million, is being spent in a variety of different ways, very effective ways. And if we get more through appropriations, we'll continue to do some of the things that the panelists here have suggested in terms of closing the research gaps.
Well, Darryl, I can think of three things. We don't lobby either, but as you can imagine, that you look at Alzheimer's. Now they have $3 billion funding, right, from several hundred million. If you look at women's health, President Biden said $12 billion. I think obviously there's got to be, as you said, interest in policymakers to support this. How do you mobilize a community, our community, climate community, to get that kind of attention is an issue. But secondly, I think the funders themselves can get together, as you guys are doing, with NSF. We've done actually a couple of convenings of all funders on NAM to discuss about how can we all strategically work together. I think that's a really important area. Particularly everybody's talking about transdisciplinary research. That's an opportunity. That leads to a third one. Within NIH itself, across ICs, with now the new leadership of Monica Bertinelli and Common Fund, possibly you guys also within, every IC can contribute to the solution of a common approach to this issue. So those are my three thoughts.
Yeah, I think those are really great. So perhaps a common fund program focused on climate change and health would be an appropriate step. I know there have been discussions about that at the highest levels at NIH. So maybe that will come to action. So let me.
Darryl, can I just say one thing in addition to that? In terms of transdisciplinary research. So I know I went to a talk recently where the focus was on climate change and, liver and kidney health. And when I asked, did you collect ovaries or from the mice, or did you look at the uterus? They had not. And so I think one way to make money or to save money is finding those collaborations. If you're already doing a study and you're already collecting data in a certain population, think about the other outcomes, reach out to a collaborator, try to combine efforts so that we aren't wasting any tissues, time, or data.
And if I can go take one more step, I think in every single research can think along that same line, right? How's climate impacting this? And therefore, as I think about my research, whether it's saving organs, tissues, clinical design, you name it, you can put a lens of environmental justice to it.
Sheri, you had a comment as well about transdisciplinary.
Yeah, I was just going to say that NIH has funded a few really transdisciplinary projects for our team. So we have this training program at Maseno University in Kenya called Sustainable Development for HIV Health, which is really bringing together trainees in public health and agriculture and climate science and economics and many other disciplines to try to address that intersection between climate change development and health. And we also, as part of that, have funded that agricultural intervention that I was talking about that was really multi-sectoral and brought together, agricultural scientists with health scientists and many other disciplines together. So there are a few that are funded that are within that domain, and we have one that I think is about to be funded as well.
So I want to spend the last 5 minutes kind of on looking forward as much as possible. And so in addition to enhancing the funding for climate change and health research transdisciplinary in a transdisciplinary way and having the various funding entities work together collaboratively. So what does success look like in this field? So if you look forward to 2030, 2035, if all the research gaps that we've talked about here are closed, what does success look like? Let me just go to each of the panel members and ask that question. So Anne-Marie, why don't you take a shot at this?
I mean, it's a big question. And I think that's also it's a really nice goal. But I think we talked about a lot of the research gaps and their implications of closing them. I think part of the gap is the communication and the sustainability of the research and changes in policy that we're implementing. So to me, that's what it looks like, a responsive system, not just the gaps we know of today, but a system in which we're consistently identifying gaps and the next thing, because this is not going to be something we just finish and are done with.
Ismayil?
I feel like 2013, we probably know everything about this climate change, how this affecting this individual human health. And then probably we have some kind of medicine or magic potion to protect our all most vulnerable population. So we give them, we'll feed them, and then they will be fine. Maybe that's the goal.
Michael?
Well, the first step would be to actually slow the onset of climate change, but that put aside, I think there's knowing the molecular level, we can develop biomarkers for epigenetics. We can develop biomarkers for the impacts of climate change. And so I think this preventative medicine shift from the reactionary medicine we use today, using these biomarkers, doing treatments and medicine to actually prevent the disease from potentially or slowing it from developing, is probably where we might be in 10 years if we push the epigenetics forward.
Okay. Arianne?
From a climate justice and health lens, success would be that it would be commonplace for communities to be involved from the very beginning in the research voice, that we are incorporating traditional knowledge and practice from Indigenous communities and local communities into the interventions that we develop. Our new technologies are developed and they ensure that they are beneficial to all. And studies that evaluate the effectiveness and justice implication of all policies consider the long-term impact on health equity, and also include the human rights perspective to help guide policy and practice. And then, climate change is a global issue, requires international cooperation. So successful research 5 to 10 years from now would build, strengthen transnational networks for knowledge sharing and resources and best practices.
Great. Sheri?
Well, since I don't think we're going to solve the wicked problem of climate change impacts on health in the next 10 years, I think some signs of success that we could hope is that there would have been a lot more funding on climate and health, both programmatically and in research, we would have really leveraged data in very important ways so we would have a much more granular understanding using precision public health of exactly who is affected by which climate health impacts and where, what are the key mechanisms of action, and what are the most important levers for resilience that can be deployed. Health systems would be better prepared for climate health disasters since we would have been better able to predict hospitalizations and emergency department use in various settings in relation to specific climate stressors. And if there would have been a lot of climate adaptation and mitigation interventions, we would better understand their economic, health, and environmental co-benefits. So we'd be in a much better position to implement evidence-based interventions that would both decrease health harms and reduce the health sector's carbon footprint.
Great. Tina.
Yeah, to me, success is we stop thinking about 10 and 15 years and we start thinking about 50 and 100 and 150 years. That's number one. Number two, we work as hard on mitigation as we do on adaptation. While a lot of what we've talked about is adaptation to the inevitability of climate change, we need to use our voice with policymakers, with governments, with state departments in using the data that we have as we collect more data. But we have plenty already to change policy and to promote mitigation. And the third thing is we need to reach success. To me would be that for every climate and health research, there is a policy arm that is funded and supported so that whatever we learn can be changed into actual effects and actual both mitigation and adaptation action. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Josh, and we have less than a minute.
I won't reiterate everything that's been said so well, but I think two things. One, inherently underlying our difficulties with climate change are difficulties psychologically with handling climate change. And so mental health and restructuring, cognitive reframing of how of how climate change is dealt with needs to be informed by mental health. And so I think mental health more broadly has to be integrated throughout climate research. And two, I think we need to walk the walk in terms of researchers. I think that the climate impact of the healthcare system was mentioned by Dr. Weiser. We currently produce 8 to 10% of all US greenhouse gas emissions, which is larger than most countries in the globe. And so I hope that in the next 10 to 15 years, as institutions in medicine, we are able to be harbingers of the kind of change we want to see. And so changing the culture of medicine to be more sustainable would be important.
Thank you. So with that, I want to thank all 7 panel members for the amazing presentations and really stimulating discussions afterwards. And so thank you so much. I believe we're going to go to a break now and then resume at 1:20 with theme 2.